All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Josh Bryant. I think we'll have several more join us as the course of the webinar goes on. We had probably 30 or 40 people signed up to attend today. This has been a popular topic of discussion. It's one that's certainly necessary. We need to have a conversation about church security. And we're going to talk about that in several respects today. First of all, we're going to start by talking about four different kinds or four different phases of a church security policy that we need to have in order to implement it properly and get it to a point where your church is most protected from a legal standpoint. All right. Now, let me preface that by saying this, that I'm not a security expert in that I'm not going to be able to tell you how to train people to carry a firearm in your church, for example, or I'm not going to be able to tell you what's the best way to secure your building without actually being in your building to see exactly what happens. But what we need to understand is that with any policy that you develop, with any action that you take within the church, there are going to be certain legal ramifications of those. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to make sure that whatever decisions we make, especially in terms of something that is such a serious topic, whatever decisions we need to make sure that we are prepared to handle whatever legal ramifications come of that, and make sure we do so in a fashion that limits your risk and your liability and your exposure to possible courtroom proceedings. So, with that said, let me tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Josh Bryant. I'm the managing attorney of Church General Counsel. And what we do is we help churches. We provide legal counsel to churches and legal consulting at a flat annual rate. We do so not at $200 an hour or anything like that. But we try to take a proactive approach in taking a look at your policies. We want to take a look at just your operations and how your church functions. And we want to make sure that we're protecting against several different types of risk that your church might encounter. We want to manage those risks. We want to set the church up to succeed. I spent 5 years as a litigation attorney and then spent another 5 years as a pastor. And interestingly enough, as this discipleship pastor, I was doing work with small groups within the church. I continually got questions from not only the church I was on staff at, but several other churches in the area as well, seeking legal assistance in developing policies around issues exactly like this one. So we're going to spend some time today talking about those. And certainly I want to be in a position where I can help you guys and help your churches be in a position where the risks associated with anything that you do, be it your child protection policy, your church security policy, whatever that may be, I want to be in a position where I can help you guys manage those risks and set your church up well, while at the same time also balancing that with your ministry needs and your church growth needs. It's really easy under these circumstances for an attorney to come in and step on the brakes and ask you not to do something because it just is too much risk. But churches take risks, and it's right to take risks for the cause of Christ. It is right to get out and do some of these ministry things, but we can do so in a fashion that protects the church, that mitigates its risk. And so that's why we're here, and that's why we're doing this particular webinar on church security, because it's something that we've got to talk about. So here's the scenario that I want to put in your mind. And as we go through this, there's going to be time for questions at the end of this. And so write down any questions you've got. You'll be able to, I'll unmute you, or you'll be able to unmute yourself. You can turn your video on if you want to, and then we'll be able to interact with one another. And so I'd certainly be very happy to do that. But let me put this scenario in your mind first. First of all, when we think of a church security problem, the first thing we think about is an active shooter on campus, right? And so I want us to imagine that right now. We've got an active shooter, that there are worshipers in your congregation who have been shot. We don't know what their medical status is. It's somebody with a church-approved concealed carry opens fire on the assailant and kills a bystander before taking down the intruder and overcoming that. Now, the son of the bystander doesn't go to your church. In fact, the son of the bystander doesn't go to church at all. He's been turned away from church for whatever reason. And he is upset about this and sues your church. Now, this is a horrible, horrible, horrible situation all the way across the board. We certainly never, ever want that to happen. But as time progresses and this lawsuit goes forward, think about this. It comes to light that this person who has a concealed carry weapon and is sanctioned by the church to do that has not cleaned his weapon or her weapon in a couple of years, and he hadn't been, or she hadn't been, to the range to fire that weapon in several months, and has never really been tested to make sure that they can put bullets on target. And so now we have this serious question as to how liable is your church? What are the risks to your church under that situation? And we can certainly say, what are the risks to your church if you don't have any security personnel there? Okay, there are risks either way you go. You run a risk of not having any kind of security policy. You run a risk of having a security policy because you very well might sanction somebody to carry a weapon that ends up killing an innocent bystander or injuring an innocent bystander in your church. And so we've got to be very careful. And so here's some questions that come up. Should your church have a security policy? All right. And I'm going to give you the lawyer's answer of it depends. Okay. It always depends. Not every church needs to have a church security policy. And it pains me to hear that going around right now, that every church needs a security policy, because what that's going to do is it's going to establish an industry standard. And if we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves where every church is going to have armed security. And I don't know that that's necessary just yet. And so we've got to be careful with that. It really depends on your unique situation. Where are you located? What is the crime like in your area? Do you have any specific threats? All of these are questions that are going to bear on what your church's security policy should be. And then you ask the question, well, what should our security policy be? I'm going to be able to give you a skeleton here, but at the end of the day, what is specific to your church? Again, it depends. We need to know how your facilities are set up. How many doors and entry and exit doors do you have? What kind of volunteer base do you have in terms of guest services and people manning doors to greet people as they come into the door? How quickly can law enforcement get there? Are you right next to a law enforcement, a police station, or is it going to take them 15 or 20 minutes to respond in the event of an active shooter? What does your insurance company have to say about it? I guarantee you, your insurance company will have something to say about your church security policy. Do you have the resources to obtain a private security company to come in and provide these services? Or do you have law enforcement officers in your community who will come and do this? Do you have law enforcement officers in your congregation who can do this? Or are you going to have to rely on lay people who are just concealed carry permit holders? All of these things depend on or affect how you're going to have to draft your church's specific church security policy. So it really depends. But with all that said, here are the 4 stages of a church security policy in terms of its implementation. There are 4 different manifestations of how this church security policy should play itself out. And so the first one we're going to talk about is hindrance. We want to hinder people from getting in the building. Then we want to talk about deterrence. We want to deter them from making any decisions that would be detrimental to themselves or detrimental to others. Third, we want to have a phase of this church security policy called dominance, meaning we want to quickly overcome any active shooter who does decide he or she is going to open fire out at your worship service. And then the 4th phase of this is evidence. We need to make sure we're collecting evidence, and we're doing so in an appropriate fashion, both for law enforcement officers, but also for your church's attorney in the event that the church gets sued for not providing security or providing wrong security or for the excessive use of force, whatever the case may be. We want to make sure we've got evidence collected so that your church is best prepared and best provided for in that situation from a legal standpoint. So let's talk about that first one, hindrance. You've heard it said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that was said in terms of medical issues, but I think the same applies in legal issues as well. And that's certainly the approach that we take in everything that we do at Church General Counsel. We want to make sure that we're doing a lot of preventative work so that we don't have to do a whole bunch of cure work. And it is always more expensive to clean up a legal mess after the fact than it is to get an attorney involved early in the process and make sure that what's being drafted, what's being put into place, all the different policies and the procedures, to make sure those things are going to hold weight in court if we ever get there, which we certainly hope we don't. So we want to hinder people first. We don't want them to even get in the door to your church. Now, the question is, how do we do that? How do we keep somebody with malintent from entering our churches and opening fire? And there's several things that we can do. The first one that I want to talk about, though, is we really cannot discount the spiritual aspect of what we're doing here. The first thing people want to talk about a lot of times is who can carry a gun. And listen, we need to do that. That's important. We need to talk about who can and cannot carry a weapon in your church. But at the same time, we've got to understand that there are spiritual implications of that. And so the first thing I'm going to tell you to do, and I think this applies no matter your circumstance, okay, because there's zero risk and zero liability in you doing this. Pray for your church, okay? And as pastors, I know you're doing that. As ministry leaders, I know you're praying for your church, but certainly pray God's protection on your church, okay? There is no legal ramification for you doing that, and ultimately, we know the Scripture tells us that our war is not against flesh and bone, and it's not against weapons of human crafting, but it's against the powers of municipalities and the authorities in the spiritual realm, in the spiritual kingdom. And so we've got to be very careful not to discount or overlook the spiritual aspects of what we're doing here. And so pray for your church. Pray for God to protect your church. Pray specifically against an active shooter on your campus, okay? It's a devastating thing. And so we want to pray against that. Now, that said, put this, the spiritual warfare aspect of this issue as a given. Let's move on into some of the practical things that we can do. First of all, you want to limit your access. You want to limit people's access to the building. All right, I'm going to say that for your entry doors, you need to have some local building codes that you might contend with. And you need to make sure you check those local building codes. But for the most part, those codes are going to deal with egress, meaning how people exit the building, not with how people enter the building. And so with that, I would say you need no more than 4 access points to your church, depending on how big it is, okay? But even the biggest ones, if you can funnel everybody through 4 entrances, that would be best. If you have to use more, you've got to use more, but I would try to limit yourself to 4 entrances. And what this does is it allows you to place personnel at the door to greet people as they come in, who can kind of start looking at, is anybody suspicious? Is anybody wearing baggy clothing? Anybody you don't recognize? Anybody walking in with an angry look on their face or anything like that? Those things that are suspicious, those can be reported quickly. All right. And so then what I would say is train your guest services team. Ultimately, some of the best churches who do well at guest assimilation, they have people in the parking lots greeting people, because once people get in the building, a lot of times, especially guests, their first impression of the church is made within the first few seconds. And a lot of times that impression that they form in the first few seconds will determine whether or not they ever come back. And so you need to have guest services personnel just from a church growth perspective, but you can train and piggyback on those guest services personnel. You can train them to make sure that they're being observant. So if they're in the parking lot, they're driving shuttles to get people in. If they're there to help people collect their stuff and just greet them in the parking lot and make it a real welcoming environment, those people can be on the lookout for anybody who's in the parking lot who may be loitering around or who may look suspicious, somebody they've never seen before. And then 2 things can happen. Number one, if there's somebody in your parking lot on a Sunday morning that you've never seen before, guest services personnel should always intercept that person. They should go up to them and greet them. Hey, how are you doing? So glad you're here. Introduce themselves, so forth and so on. If they are suspicious, if they're not engaging, if they won't talk, or it looks like they've got malintent, then they need to have a way to communicate that inside to your senior leadership quickly. And so train those guest services personnel to do that. There's the story about the Ritz-Carlton. And this is, again, a good church growth principle. But at the Ritz-Carlton, one of the reasons they're so good at what they do is that when somebody pulls up to valet parking and gets out of the car, there's somebody there who greets them and asks their name and gets their name. And then they radio that into the front desk. So by the time they get to the front desk, the personnel at the front desk can say, "Good afternoon, Mr. Bryant. Welcome to the Ritz-Carlton. We're glad you're here." Now, I've never been to the Ritz-Carlton, so I'm relaying this, second and third hand information. But at the end of the day, that level of personal interaction is one of the things that makes Ritz-Carlton such a great hotel. And so we can incorporate a lot of those. And Andy Stanley talks about this a lot, incorporating that into how we lead the church. And so if we can do that, and then we can piggyback on that by training guest services personnel to be on the lookout for anybody who's suspicious and try to engage those people in the parking lot, then what we've done is we have hindered them at that point from even getting in the building to carry out their plan. Finally, on this issue, what I would say is you need to have a means of locking down your children's area. There are several ways to do it, and there's really very little legal liability as long as the legal guardians have access to their children and there's proper security behind any locked doors. But whether you lock down the kids' entrance once the worship service starts, or you lock down the kids' area all the time, and you have to have volunteer or church staff escort kids to their rooms, but no parents are allowed back there. Whatever the case may be, you've got to definitely limit your access to the kids' area. So the first step that we've talked about is we want to hinder people from coming in to the church who have malintent. Okay, we don't want to hinder everybody, but just those with malintent, we want to hinder them from getting in. Second thing we want to do is we want to deter them from doing anything stupid. Okay, we want to stop them from doing anything that would obviously hurt your church. And so the way we do that, you can do that several things. First of all, you need to deter them by knowledge of your security precautions. They need to know what your security precautions are to a certain degree. And if they know that they're coming into a place where there is security in place, it causes them to pause, and they need to rethink what they're doing. Okay, so how can you do that? First of all, I'm always going to advise churches to retain a private security company. Okay, that is the best way that you can limit your legal liability in the event of an active shooter. Okay, because anybody with a private security company, hopefully those guys are going to be well trained. They're going to be law enforcement officer or ex-military or somebody else. And ultimately, the liability of the misuse of a firearm in that case is going to fall on that company more than it is on your church. And it just spreads out some of the risk there. All right, so I'm going to advise that. Not every church can afford to hire a private security company. That can be a large and very expensive undertaking. So if you can't, either way, people need to be able to tell who security is at your church. And so you need a means of identifying security. That could be, a reflective vest. It could just be a name badge. It could be a specific shirt that you ask all your security personnel to wear and all your volunteers, that, something that says security on it. You could put them in uniforms for all I care. They need to be visible, and people need to know that they're there, okay? Even if their weapons are concealed, they need to know that security is there. You need to clearly display your weapons policy. If you're going to allow concealed carry by anyone on campus, you need to display that weapons policy. You need to be honest about what that is. Don't say, we have guns on campus, but in reality, you've banned them. You don't want that level of dishonesty, but you want to make sure that people know that there are people on site with weapons in the event of an active shooter. Okay, and so if they see a sign, somebody with malintent coming into your church, they see something posted on the front door or a sign somewhere that says, weapons of any kind are prohibited except by permission of the senior pastor or church administrator. Under those circumstances, they're going to say, okay, this is how, there are people here who obviously have permission of the church to carry a weapon. You can even go further to say, in order to obtain a license to carry a weapon in these facilities, please contact this person or call the church office at this number. Okay, under those circumstances, they now have knowledge that there are people on site with weapons. Okay, and so you need to be able to broadcast that. You want people to know that when they come into church, if they have malintent. Okay, hopefully that will cause them to pause. If not, hopefully there's another sign that you can put up that would cause them to pause, and that's going to be a policy that says surveillance cameras are actively monitored. So not only do you need a sign that says surveillance cameras are actually monitored, if you have the budget, you need to have security cameras. They need to be visible, and you need to have somebody sitting behind a computer that's a volunteer or whatever who's watching those security cameras, looking out for suspicious activity while you have a great number of people on site at your campus. All right, and so again, between visible security personnel, between a security policy that's clearly posted, and conspicuously posted at entryways or in driveways, whatever, and then heavy surveillance in terms of security cameras, those three things added all together can cause somebody, hopefully would cause them to pause and say, number one, I might get killed here doing this. Number two, they're going to have evidence of it. I may not get away with this. It's not like I can come in here, shoot the place up, and just leave. They're going to have video evidence, and there's people watching, whatever the case may be. So, ultimately, I wouldn't stop there. I wouldn't, place all my eggs in one basket and say, we're going to start with hindrance and deterrence, and that's all we're going to do. If they shoot the place up, they shoot the place up. I think you need to go a little bit further, but in the end of the day, I do strongly recommend at least both those aspects of a church security policy, is that you try to hinder people from getting in the building, and then you deter them from making that decision to pull the trigger by providing evidence or at least visibility of a security protocol in place. All right. So the third thing we're going to do is we want dominance. Okay, well, we don't want somebody coming in and being able to just shoot for 10 or 15 minutes straight without being able to quickly overpower that person and save people's lives. Okay, so the third phase of this church security policy is dominance. You want to exercise all of the security systems and procedures that you have incorporated, and you want to use those to overcome an attack. All right. So how do you do that? Again, start with a private security company if you can do it. If you can afford it, start with a private security company. If not, let's go on to the next one. First of all, you're going to want to deploy an emergency response team. All right. And this is where the bulk of the conversation right now takes place, is what does this emergency response team look like? Okay. Should not just consist of people who carry weapons. Okay. Certainly your emergency response personnel, some of them that may need to carry weapons, and that's fine. But it also needs to include people like emergency first responders, emergency medical technicians, or doctors or nurses. Somebody in the event of a slip and fall, or somebody, heaven forbid, have a heart attack at your church, somebody who can immediately respond to that. We've got an emergency. We need a professional who can step in, take charge, and try to save somebody's life. Okay, so you're going to have an emergency response team that's made up of firefighters, EMT, police, doctors, nurses, ex-military, whatever. This is your emergency response team. Now, specific to active shooter incidences or church security issues, here's where this emergency response team comes into play. Okay, and there needs to be a policy that governs this team. It's something that's written requirements, written rules, written standards. And the first thing I would say is, as a policy, you need to limit who you sanction to carry. Okay, now in some states, you will be able to tell somebody no, don't carry on campus. You can do that if you want to. If you don't want to do that, that's fine as well. I advise against it for several reasons, which we'll go to in a minute, but you at least need to have a list of people that say these people are sanctioned to carry. They are volunteers on our emergency response team. Now, why would I limit who can carry on campus? In the event of an active shooter event, I think it is wise for you to be able to print off a list of people who are sanctioned to carry and hand that to law enforcement officers when they get there. They put it in their command in their command flow, and ultimately, in the event that this turns into a hostage situation, or somebody, the law enforcement gets there and the assailant holds himself up in a Sunday school classroom or something like that. Ultimately, we don't want somebody who is sanctioned to carry to get shot. Okay, and law enforcement's coming in here. They don't know what's going on. They don't know who the assailant is. They don't know what the assailant looks like. And so anybody with a weapon, they are immediately going to neutralize. And so it's good for them to have a list. Here are the people, here are their pictures, or here's a copy of their driver's license, or here's just their names even, the people who we have sanctioned to carry a weapon on this campus. So that can stave off some confusion early on. So I would limit who you sanction to carry for that reason. Number two, require those that you sanction to have a concealed carry permit. Okay, it is illegal to carry a weapon, to conceal a weapon without a permit in most states. Okay, and so they need to have a concealed carry permit before they come into your church. You certainly don't want people that you sanction to carry a weapon to not be following the law. And so have them get that concealed carry permit. Third, require those you sanction to carry to be qualified in the use of their weapon. And there are any number of different ways you can do this. Okay, the NRA has a qualification process that folks can go through. I've had churches who just say, look, we're going to require you to place 90% of your rounds on target from 21 feet, and you're going to shoot 50 rounds. Okay, so you've got to get 45 of those rounds on target at 21 feet before you're qualified to carry at the church. So require them in some way, shape, manner, or form to qualify to carry that weapon. And we can talk about different scoring systems or certifications, or whether you just want to say you've got to put so many rounds on target at such and such a distance. Okay. Then require those that you sanction to carry, require them to recertify. It shouldn't be just a one-time thing. Hey, I put 45 rounds on target at 21 feet. What you need to do is you need to say, okay, you need to do that every 6 months, or you need to do it once a quarter or once a year, whatever is appropriate for your church. So require them to requalify annually, at least annually, I would say. Then require those you sanction to undergo de-escalation training. Okay, and here's why I say that. De-escalation training is a process by which law enforcement officers in a dangerous situation are trained how to de-escalate. It's kind of explains itself in the terminology there, but they are trained in methods of trying to calm somebody who has a weapon down and end the situation without firing a shot. Okay. Now, here's why I say that I think that's necessary, is that probably the greatest risk to a church is if somebody claims an excessive use of force, okay, that they didn't try to de-escalate the situation when it could have been de-escalated. They use deadly force, and then somebody, a family member of the assailant, or the assailant himself or herself, if the assailant doesn't die as we're trying to overcome an attack. If anybody in your church shoots first, heaven forbid, that was probably going to be scrutinized under an excessive use of force. Okay, and so we want to make sure people don't get the church into that situation. Here's the deal. There are insurance policies out there that will cover the church in this situation, but they usually are going to exclude any instance in which a court or somebody else finds that the church employed excessive use of force. And so your insurance isn't going to cover you at that point, and now we're in trouble. So require those who carry, that you sanction to carry and that are part of this team, require them to undergo some sort of de-escalation training. All right, require those you sanction to carry to obtain personal firearm liability insurance, and then, if possible, list your church as a secondary insured. In fact, you may even want to pay the premiums on that personal firearm liability insurance. And what this does, there are several different policies out there. The one that I'm most familiar with, it provides attorney fees for the person who used the weapon in the event that they are charged with manslaughter or charged with another crime because the local prosecutor or grand jury doesn't feel like the use of force there was appropriate. It's going to provide legal fees for that. It's going to provide liability insurance in the event that somebody gets hurt. It'll cover the weapon if the weapon is damaged in any way during the course of its use. So there are all sorts of different things that it covers. But if the church can be listed as a secondary insured on a policy like that, in the event that somebody you sanction to carry uses excessive force, then you'll have another insurance policy that you'll be able to fall back on. It's not all that expensive. I've seen it as low as $250, as high as $500 and up per year as far as the premiums are concerned. So it's not all that expensive. It's certainly a good idea for anybody who carries a weapon to have that type of insurance. And so I think it's just wise. Have the church either pay for it or have the person that you sanction to carry that weapon, have them get that insurance. And it's called Personal Firearm Liability Insurance, or PFLI. All right. Then require those that you sanction to carry to sign an agreement that gives them permission to carry on campus, and in exchange indemnifies the church from their negligent use of the weapon. All right. And so here's what that means. Ultimately, you're going to give them a license. Okay. And a license, from a legal perspective, the term license just means permission. Okay. So you're going to give them permission or a license to carry a firearm on campus. And in exchange, they're going to follow all the rules that you've set, and they're going to indemnify the church if they are found to have negligently used their weapon. So what that means is that if they use their weapon negligently, the church is going to get sued. Okay, it's going to happen. If they are found to be negligent, though, the person who's carrying that weapon, they will then be fully responsible if they indemnify the church. Okay, so indemnity just means, I'm going to indemnify you. That means I'm going to pay any damages that you were ordered to pay as a result of any action that I take. Okay, so have them have the person who's going to carry the weapon indemnify you in the event that they misuse it. Okay. And then finally, make sure you talk to your general liability carrier about your coverage, okay? And you need to have your attorney look that over, okay? There are cases, matter of fact, there was a case that came out of, where was that? I want to say it was Indiana, I think. Case out of Indiana. No, it wasn't. It was Minnesota. I'm sorry. It was in Minnesota. And it was a different kind of insurance policy, but the churches that took this particular insurance policy out didn't read it real well. And if they did, they didn't understand exactly what was and was not covered. And so there was a whole swath of conduct that wasn't covered in several churches where certain bad behavior was going on. And the church ended up suing the insurance company, and the insurance company won. So make sure you have your attorney review these policies with you. Make sure you know exactly what is excluded. A lot of times people will go out and buy this firearm protection coverage thinking that anything is covered. And it's just not the case. As a matter of fact, there are all sorts of exclusions. I was just recently dealing with a church, and they didn't realize how much was excluded. And for that very reason, they went and had their emergency response team go get one of those personal firearm liability insurance coverages. So make sure you talk to your general liability carrier. They're going to have guidelines. They're going to have recommendations on what policies and what rules you put in place. Follow them, because if you don't follow those rules, they're not going to cover any claim that's filed. Okay, so certainly Deploy your emergency response team, but have an active shooter policy. You need to have an active shooter policy as well. So you've got one policy that covers and governs this emergency response team, but you also have an active shooter policy that says, in the event of an active shooter on campus, here's what we're going to do. And you need to train on this. Your Sunday school teachers, your key leaders in the worship center, your ushers, your deacons, other people, your emergency response team, you need to train on these scenarios, okay? So determine, first of all, how are you going to communicate active shooter to everybody else in the church, okay? And so ultimately, if somebody comes into the worship center and opens fire, you're probably going to have kids in the nursery. You may have other people. If you've got multiple services, you may have some people in Sunday school classrooms, whatever the case may be. You need to be able to communicate an active shooter to key personnel throughout your campus. So you need to talk about how to do that. Okay, do you do that through walkie-talkies? Do you do that through some sort of emergency text messaging system? Whatever the case may be, figure out how you're going to communicate that, and then practice that. Okay, practice doing those things. All right, you need to be able to communicate what your run, hide, and fight protocols are for key leaders. Okay, and so in certain circumstances, when those protocols are implemented saying we've got an active shooter, there are going to be some circumstances where you want people to run, get out of the building, get as far away from here as you can, run. All right. Sometimes that's not going to be safe. So you're going to want them to hide. And so we need to talk about how do you barricade yourself in, or how do you lead others to barricade themselves in a Sunday school room or a closet or a bathroom? How do you do those things? And then there are going to be some times where you just have to fight, where your key personnel have to engage an active shooter. So train leaders on what to do. You need to talk about what circumstances you run, what circumstances do you hide, what circumstances do you fight back. And then finally, you need to talk about what equipment you need in order to get this done, okay? Specifically in terms of barricading yourselves in rooms. A lot of places will just say, hey, take all the chairs, stack them up, put them up against the door, and use that as an appropriate barricade. There are certainly devices that you can have in the rooms that will lock people out from the outside, complete barricade. You can do that as well. So talk through all those things, make sure those are in place and ready to go. And then finally, the last thing we want to talk about is evidence preservation, okay? Evidence preservation. In this final phase, this is after the active shooter incident is over. He or she's been neutralized, whatever the case may be. Everything is over, okay? Now what we've got to do is we've got to preserve evidence. So how do we do that? First of all, your security cameras need to be recording, okay? And so as your security cameras record, you need to make sure you can have a recording of everything that took place to turn over to law enforcement and to turn over to your church's attorney. You need to isolate witnesses, okay? Anybody who saw anything, you need to set them aside. You need to instruct them not to talk to anybody, and there are reasons why it has to do with psychology and how the brain works, but ultimately when they start talking about it, they start getting facts wrong. So you need to tell them, be quiet, don't talk to anybody about what happened, stay over here, wait until somebody comes by to get your statement, okay? So isolate witnesses and instruct them not to talk to anybody but pastoral staff and law enforcement, all right? Pastoral staff don't need to ask witnesses what happened or what they saw. They need to simply hand out an incident report form, okay? And I can help you draft one of those, but basically you're going to take a form that says, here's my name, my address, my phone number, my email address, my blood type, my social security, get all the information you can. I'm being facetious a little bit, but get all the information you can. And then just a statement, write out a narrative of what happened, okay? And get them to sign it at the bottom, and that's the statement, okay? Instruct them to fill out that incident report. And then anybody who had a cell phone, if they took videos, if they took pictures of anything, get those videos, get those pictures, okay? The more evidence we have of what happened, the better chance law enforcement has of coming to a quick resolution, and certainly the more your attorney is going to have in order to help keep you from hopefully being in court for too long if the church gets sued. All right, and so do that. You need to evacuate everybody else from the premises at that point, okay? If law enforcement's not there yet, get everybody outside. If they are there, law enforcement will take over and they will start talking about how to evacuate people. But get people out of the building. Don't touch anything. Don't touch anything. And instruct people not to touch anything. Because the crime scene investigators, I mean, that's a real thing. CSI is real. They're going to want to come in. They're going to want to take pictures. They're going to want to dust for prints. They're going to want to look at all possible avenues of obtaining evidence. They're going to count shell casings. They're going to count bullet holes in the wall. Don't touch anything and tell people not to touch anything. All right. And so all that needs to be written in a policy document. That needs to be broadcast and communicated out to key leaders. Certainly everybody on the emergency response team needs to have that. And we're going to go through all 4 of those phases. And people need to know what those 4 phases are. They need to be trained on those 4 phases. And listen, hopefully this is never an issue, okay? And even though this is the biggest topic of conversation right now in terms of church security issues, ultimately, your church's security, you are far more likely to have somebody steal money than you are to have an active shooter. And so if your church security, your overall church security strategy does not include, proper financial controls and things like that, you have gaps that you need to fill. You are far more likely to have somebody molest or offend against a child in your nursery, your kids area, your student area. Far more likely for something like that to happen than you are to have an active shooter in your church. So again, if you don't have those policies in place, there are gaps in your church security, and you need to make sure those are covered. Obviously, you need to have locks on doors and key. I mean, there are so many different aspects of church security that you need to look at, and this can't be it. But in light of recent events and a lot of certain mass shootings, and especially mass shootings happening in churches, this is a key area which needs to be discussed. And so with that, I am finished with my presentation portion of it. I will open the floor to any questions that anybody may have.